welcome back to Comics Let's Talk. I'm Kevin Gibbon once again, and today we're going to talk about the Shadow and the Batman concurrent timelines. Dynamite and DC have given us a Shadow and Batman team-up, and it's very good. I'm going to read my reviews, which are published on the Comics for Sinners website, and I also have a column on that website. In that column, I usually discuss my own creation of Carl Vincent Vampire Hunter, looking at the novels, comic books, and movies in production right now. If you love comic books as much as I do, you're going to hit the subscribe button just below this screen. Subscribe to my channel, and we'll talk about comic books. Also, go to Facebook. Look up the Carl Vincent Vampire Hunter page. If you like what you see here when I discuss Carl Vincent Vampire Hunter, like the page on Facebook for Carl Vincent Vampire Hunter, and we'll keep you up to date on everything that's happening. The current story is Dracula Rising, art by Rodolfo Ezequiel. The film is in production right now from Crisp Filmworks out of Lakeland, Florida. Everything Carl Vincent Vampire Hunter you can find on Indie Planet, Drive-Thru Comics, and Amazon, as well as Kindle. Let's take a look at my review for The Shadow Batman Crossover #1. It is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma, but perhaps there is a key. This is by far one of the greatest Batman crossovers since the Batman Hulk crossover in the late 70s, and I've only just read issue 1. This issue starts in New York on New Year's Eve. The Pig is trying to control the masses with his Dollotron masks. Batman shows up, Robin, the Damian Wayne version, shows up, and it's a hell of a ride. Looking at the creative team, Steve Orlando keeps us guessing throughout issue 1 just who is in control of those Dollotron masks. What appears to be a simple megalomaniac trying to take over the citizens of New York has far deeper implications. We don't learn why Batman is in New York in this issue, but his arrival is timely. Robin's presence is an equally unwanted surprise, and the Shadow is only in this issue briefly, but his arrival is significant and shows a connection to the past. There's plenty of action for the comic book fans, but also a lot to think about for those who want methods to our madness. It's great stuff. Giovanni Timpano is the perfect artist to bring these two franchises together. The creator of Eclipse has already worked on The Shadow, and if he hasn't worked for DC on any Batman titles yet, I don't recall him on any of the top of my head, the creators of the Caped Crusader really need to bring him on board. His work is dark and his panels rich with shadows, and he brings a certain menace to both Bruce Wayne and Ken Allard that greatly enhance Orlando's story. Both the Batman splash and the Shadow splash alone make this issue worth the cover price. I loved his art, and he's fast becoming one of my favorites in the medium. In conclusion, it's a great beginning to a legendary team-up. I cannot say how surprised I was to learn that this crossover was coming. I was worried that they may not do both characters justice. One would overshadow the other. But this is awesome. It should develop into a fantastic story. I always thought that the Batman Shadow team-up should take place in the 1940s, when Batman was fresh and the Shadow was at his peak in popularity. Boy, was I wrong. The Damian Wayne Robin is the perfect anti-hero in this issue, and he helps issue 1 come to a rousing conclusion. Could Damian really? Well, no spoilers here. Let's just say that issue 1 ends with a calculating Damian Wayne doing the unthinkable to his father. To be continued. And now let's look at the timeline. A little history of both the Shadow and the Batman concurrently. Going to look at Wikipedia for the most part on this show. The Shadow began as a narrator for the Detective Story Hour, a show which was used to promote its sister magazine. When readers began asking specifically for that Shadow Mystery magazine, the publisher began to brainstorm and create an original character. Recognizing the demand and responding promptly, circulation manager Henry William Ralston of Street and Smith commissioned Walter B. Gibson to begin writing stories using the pen name of Maxwell Grant and claiming the stories were from the Shadow's private annals as told to him. Gibson wrote 282 out of 324 tales over the next 20 years. A novel-length story twice a month, the first story produced was The Living Shadow, published April 1st, 1931. Gibson's characterizations of the Shadow laid the foundation for the archetype of the superhero, including stylized imagery and title, sidekicks, supervillains, and a secret identity. Clad in black, the Shadow operated mainly after dark as a vigilante in the name of justice, and terrifying criminals into vulnerability. Gibson himself claimed that literary inspirations upon which he had drawn were Bram Stoker's Dracula and Edward Bulwer-Lytton's The House and the Brain. Another possible inspiration for the Shadow is the French character Judex. The first episode of the original Judex film serial was released in the United States as The Mysterious Shadow, and Judex's costume is rather like the Shadow's. French comic historian Xavier Fournier notes other similarities with another silent serial, The Shielding Shadow, whose protagonist had a power of invisibility, and considers the Shadow to be a mix between the two characters. In the 1940s, some Shadow comic strips were translated in France as Adventures of Judex. In print, the Shadow's real name is Kent Allard, and he was a famed aviator who fought for the French during World War I. Allard falsifies his death in the South American jungles, then returns to the United States, arriving in New York City. He adopts numerous identities to conceal his existence. One of the identities Allard assumes, indeed the best known, is that of Lamont Cranston, a wealthy young man about town. In the pulps, Cranston is a separate character. Allard frequently disguises himself as Cranston and adopts his identity. The supporting cast for the Shadow includes Harry Vincent, an operative whose life he saved when Vincent tried to commit suicide in the first Shadow story. Also Moses Mo Shrevnitz, aka Shrevy, a cab driver who doubles as his chauffeur. Then there's Margot Lane, no relation to Lois, a socialite created for the radio drama and later introduced into the pulps. Also Clyde Burke, a newspaper reporter who also is paid to collect news clippings for the Shadow. We come to Burbank, a radio operator who maintains contact between the Shadow and his agents. He was portrayed by Andre Gregory in the 1994 film. There's also Cliff Marsland. He first appeared in the 9th novel, Mobsman on the Spot. He is a man with a checkered past, known to the Shadow, who changed his name to Clifford Marsland. He spent years in Sing Sing jail for a crime he did not commit, and is wrongly believed to have murdered one or more people by the underworld. Now, Batman is a bit better known to modern audiences, so only a brief introduction here. Since the Shadow was a direct influence on Batman, it's only fitting that they have similar tropes. Batman's secret identity is Bruce Wayne, a wealthy playboy, kind of like Lamont Cranston, who dons a cape and cowl to fight crime. His supporting cast includes Robin, the Boy Wonder, his sidekick, plus the butler, Alfred Pennyworth. And now let's take a look at the Shadow and Batman's timeline. In 1930, the Shadow debuted as the narrator for Detective Story Hour, a show which was used to promote its sister magazine. When readers began asking specifically for that Shadow mystery magazine, the publishers began to brainstorm and create an original character. In 1931, Walter B. Gibson takes the Shadow and develops the concept into a serialized character that would later influence superhero characters, especially Batman. In April of that year, the Shadow debuted in his own pulp magazine. Universal Pictures would later release several film shorts with the Shadow.
Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The Shadow knows.
In 1937, the Shadow debuted in his own radio show with Death House Rescue, which you can hear on YouTube and David Von Peen's old-time radio channel. The Shadow was characterized as having the power to cloud men's minds so they cannot see him. As in the magazine stories, the Shadow was not given the literal ability to become invisible. The weed of crime bears bitter fruit. Crime does not pay. The Shadow knows. Some early episodes, however, used the alternate statement, as you sow evil, so shall you reap evil. Crime does not pay. The Shadow knows. By contrast, Batman never had his own radio show. However, he would appear sometimes on Superman's radio show. Grand National Pictures released its first Shadow film, The Shadow Strikes, followed by International Crime. In 1939, the first Batman story debuts in the pages of Detective Comics number 27, The Case of the Chemical Syndicate. Bill Finger later admitted that the story was inspired by a Shadow novel, Partners of Peril. In 1940, Columbia Pictures released a 15-chapter movie serial featuring the Shadow. The Shadow becomes adapted to syndicated newspaper comic strips. In 1942, the Shadow newspaper strip ceases publication. In 1943, the first Columbia Batman serial was released, starring Lewis Wilson and Douglas Croft. In 1946, Monogram Pictures released the first of 3 low-budget films with Kane Richmond as the character of the Shadow. In 1949, the Shadow magazine ceases publication. These strips would be collected into comic book form years later. Also in 1949, the second Columbia Batman serial was released with Robert Lowry and Johnny Duncan. In 1954, the Shadow radio program ceases. The first attempt to bring the character to television fails. In 1958, the unsold pilot for a second attempt at a television series was re-edited and released as a Shadow motion picture, Bourbon Street Shadows. In 1963, Walter B. Gibson wrote 3 new official stories between 1963 and 1980. The first of these began a new series of 9 updated Shadow novels from Belmont Books, starting with Return of the Shadow, under his own byline. In these last 8 novels, the Shadow was given psychic powers, including the radio character's ability to cloud men's minds so that he effectively became invisible, and was more of a spy master than a crime fighter. In 1964, Archie Comics ran an 8-issue comic book Shadow, where the character at first resembled the radio counterpart, but was later given superpowers and a costume. Also in 1964, sales for Batman were on the decline, and editor Julius Schwartz revamped the character with a new look, bringing the character back to his detective roots. Then in 1966, the first Batman movie with Adam West and Burt Ward was released, as well as the campy ABC TV series with the same actors. The comic would mimic the high camp hijinks to great success and revitalize the character. In 1969, the television series had long since gone off the air, and the Batman comic books, with declining sales, returned Batman to its detective roots once again. In 1973, DC Comics brought us an atmospheric interpretation of the character of the Shadow by Denny O'Neil and Michael Kaluta. The Shadow first met Batman in Batman number 253, and the Caped Crusader describes the character as his biggest inspiration. In 1986, DC gave us another adaptation of the Shadow by Howard Chaykin, The Shadow, Blood and Judgment. Though it was successful, it wasn't popular with traditional Shadow fans because it diverted from the source material. Then we come to 1987. The Shadow, set in our modern era, was continued as a monthly DC Comics series by writer Andy Helfer, who was the editor of the miniseries. It was primarily by artists Bill Sienkiewicz and Kyle Baker. Then in 1988, O'Neil and Kaluta with inker Russ Heath returned to The Shadow with Marvel Comics graphic novel The Shadow, Hitler's Astrologer. Set during World War II, this one-shot appeared in both hardcover and trade paperback editions. In 1989, DC brings us another new Shadow series, The Shadow Strikes. The first Tim Burton Batman is released, with Michael Keaton in the role. In 1992, Michael Keaton returned to the Batman character with Batman Returns. Then in 1993, Dark Horse Comics attained the rights to the character of the Shadow and released several issues and trade paperbacks. In 1994, Universal Pictures brought us another interpretation of the Shadow with Alec Baldwin as Lamont Cranston. In 1995, Batman Forever, this time with Val Kilmer as Bruce Wayne Batman, is released, featuring Tommy Lee Jones as Two-Face and Jim Carrey as the Riddler. In 1997, we get Batman and Robin, with George Clooney, Chris O'Donnell as Robin, and Alicia Silverstone as Batgirl. But this time, Batgirl isn't Barbara Gordon, Commissioner Gordon's daughter. She is Alfred Pennyworth's niece in this continuity. Arnold Schwarzenegger will play the main villain of Mr. Freeze, with Uma Thurman as Poison Ivy. In 2005, Batman Begins with Christian Bale is released. Then in 2008, The Dark Knight with Heath Ledger's Oscar-winning performance as the Joker. Finally, in 2011, Dynamite Comics acquires the rights to The Shadow and has released several miniseries and an ongoing title, keeping The Shadow alive in the present day. Then in 2012, The Dark Knight Rises with Tom Hardy as Bane is released. In 2015, The Shadow returned in the authorized novel The Sinister Shadow, which was an entry in the Wild Adventures of Doc Savage series from Altus Press. The novel was written by Will Murray, who used unpublished material originally written in 1932 by Doc Savage originator Lester Dent and published under the pen name of Kenneth Robeson. It was set in 1933. The story details the conflict between the two pulp magazine icons. In 2016 comes a sequel, Empire of Doom, which takes place several years later in 1940. Here, the Shadow's old enemy, Shaiwan Khan, attacks his hated adversary, and Doc Savage joins forces with the Shadow to vanquish him in a Doc Savage novel written by Will Murray from a concept by Lester Dent. Also in 2016, we get Batman Superman Dawn of Justice with Ben Affleck. The latest feature, which has Batman, but not the Shadow, is the current Justice League film in theaters this month. And that was our look at the history timeline of the Shadow as well as the Batman right here on Comics Let's Talk. I'm Kevin Given. If you love comic books, hit the subscribe button just below this screen. Subscribe to my channel and we'll talk about comic books. You can check out my comic book reviews on the Comics for Sinners website, as well as my column Given to Me, which generally chronicles the history of the Carl Vincent franchise, which is my own franchise. In that column, we look at the making of the major motion picture from Crisp Filmworks in Lakeland, Florida, plus the comic books that have been produced and all of the news that concerns Carl Vincent Vampire Hunter. To keep up to date, go to Facebook and like the Carl Vincent Vampire Hunter page. Until next week, this is Kevin Given for Comics Let's Talk, saying keep reading those comic books.